Brooklyn, 1933. A second-floor walk-up on Sackett Street. Anna Kowalski is rendering pork fat in a chipped enamel pot, the kind of fat the new federal pamphlets call dangerous. Her windows are open because the rendering smells, and the smell carries down to the street, where her neighbor, Mrs. Bianchi, is salting eggplant on a fire escape. Both of these women are technically breaking somebody's rules. Anna is reusing fat. The Department of Agriculture told her to throw out. Mrs. Bianchi is curing meat in a tenement, which the Board of Health has declared a public hazard. Both women are also feeding their families on under $9 a week. This is the story of 20 cooking techniques that kept Americans alive during the Depression, and the regulators, reformers, and food executives who decided those techniques had to go. Number 14 was specifically targeted by New York City sanitarians in 1934. Number 7 was banned in school cafeterias by 1939, replaced with something demonstrably worse. Number 2 was so effective that the canned food industry lobbied for years to convince housewives it was unsafe. None of these tricks were dangerous. Most of them are now sold back to us at farmers markets and Brooklyn restaurants for prices that would have fed Anna Kowalski's family for a month. The food was not lost because it was inferior. It was lost because America decided convenience mattered more than craft, and because the people who knew how to do it were poor, foreign-born, or female, which in the 1930s meant their knowledge did not count. Food. Number 20. The perpetual soup pot. In a coal-heated kitchen in Pittsburgh's Hill District, the soup pot never went cold. A Slovak housewife in 1932 kept a pot of stock at the back of her stove for weeks at a time, replenishing it daily with bones, vegetable trimmings, and the water from boiled potatoes. Each evening, the pot came forward to the hot burner. Each morning, it was pushed back. The soup that came out of it on Saturday was thicker, deeper, and more savory than anything that went in on Monday. The technique works because slow, repeated heating draws gelatin out of cartilage and minerals out of bone, while the constant evaporation concentrates flavor. Modern food scientists have a name for it: continuous reduction. French restaurants call it a master stock and charge accordingly. Slovak grandmothers called it Tuesday. By 1936, home economics extension agents were touring industrial cities, telling housewives that perpetual stock was unsanitary and that proper cooking meant single-batch broths made with commercial bouillon cubes. The new advice came packaged with a vocabulary of shame, words like germ-ridden and old country, and it landed hardest on immigrant women who could not afford to argue with a woman in a hat holding a clipboard. The pot went cold. The bouillon cube took its place. A bone broth shop in Manhattan now sells 8 ounces for $9. Food. Number 19. Cooking with beer mash. Prohibition technically ended in December 1933, but home brewing in working-class neighborhoods had never really stopped. In Milwaukee, German families used the spent grain from their basement brewing, the soft, sweet mash left over after the wort was drawn off, and baked it into dense, nutty breads. The bread was high in protein, low in cost, and tasted like dark caramel. Federal revenue agents did not care that the bread was made from a byproduct. The Bureau of Prohibition, even after repeal, prosecuted unlicensed home brewing aggressively into the late 1930s, and possession of mash was treated as evidence of intent. A Milwaukee Sentinel report from 1937 described a raid in which agents seized 2 loaves of cooling bread alongside the still. The bread vanished with the brewers. Only now, with the craft beer boom, has spent grain bread reappeared. Sold at $4 a loaf in breweries that learned the technique from books, written by people whose grandmothers were arrested for it. Food number 18. Liver and onions on Wednesday. Beef liver in 1934 cost 5 cents a pound. Calf's liver, the milder cut, ran about 12. Steak ran 38. Across the industrial Midwest, Wednesday was liver night. Not because anyone particularly loved it, but because the iron and B vitamin density of organ meat carried a working family through the back half of the week. Anemia was the quiet epidemic of the Depression, and women who could not name a single vitamin understood, with the precision of clinicians, that liver fixed tiredness. The dish was simple. The liver was sliced thin, dredged in seasoned flour, and seared in bacon fat. Onions cooked low and slow until they collapsed into something sweet enough to hide the iron tang. A spoonful of vinegar at the end cut the richness and, although nobody knew it then, increased the absorption of non-heme iron by a measurable amount. After the war, the meat industry pivoted. Organ meats were rebranded as variety meats, and variety meats were rebranded as pet food. By the 1960s, Americans associated liver with cat dishes and childhood trauma. The phrase organ meat itself became a punchline. A restaurant in Portland now serves seared chicken liver on toast for $16 and calls it a chef's tribute to working-class cooking. Anna Kowalski would have recognized the dish. She would have charged less. Food number 17, vinegar pie. In a sharecropper's kitchen in Alabama in 1935, there are no apples. There is no lemon. There is sugar sometimes, and there is flour. And there is the half bottle of cider vinegar that has been on the shelf since the previous summer. Out of these things, a woman makes a pie that tastes somehow of citrus and butter and warmth. Vinegar pie works because acetic acid mimics the brightness of fruit acid, and a long, slow bake transforms the harshness into something rounded and almost floral. The custard sets into a translucent amber that tastes nothing like its ingredients. The trick is balance. Too little sugar and the pie is sour. Too much and it loses the lift. Women learn the ratio by hand, by year, by daughter. Home economics curricula in the 1940s and 1950s explicitly excluded what they called distress recipes, vinegar pie, water pie, mock apple pie, on the grounds that teaching them encouraged poverty thinking. By 1955, the recipe survived only an oral tradition in the rural South. Most cookbooks dropped it entirely. It is now, predictably, on the dessert menu of a farm-to-table restaurant in Asheville, where it is described as a forgotten Southern classic and sells for $12 a slice. Food number 16, the fat crock. Every working kitchen in 1932 had a fat crock, a covered ceramic jar that lived next to the stove and collected every scrap of usable fat. Bacon drippings, beef tallow, the pale layer skimmed from chicken broth, the rendered fat from a pork roast. The crock was strained weekly through cheesecloth and used for everything: frying, baking, sealing preserves, greasing pans, polishing cast iron, treating chapped hands. Cooking through accumulated fat creates flavor compounds that fresh oil cannot. The bacon fat from Sunday's breakfast carries into Monday's green beans, into Tuesday's biscuits, into Friday's gravy, building a continuity of flavor across a week of meals. This is again what restaurants now charge for. They call it building depth. In 1948, the American Heart Association began its first major public campaign against animal fats. By the 1960s, women's magazines were running features urging housewives to throw out their fat crocks and replace them with bottles of corn oil and Crisco. The science underpinning that advice has since been substantially walked back, particularly the demonization of saturated fat from traditional sources. But 2 generations of cooks were taught that their grandmothers had been slowly poisoning them. A pound of grass-fed beef tallow in a glass jar with a hand-lettered label sells for $22 at a butcher shop in Williamsburg. What you are watching across these first 5 entries is a pattern that repeats throughout the Depression and the decades that followed it. The food techniques that disappeared were not the ones that failed. They were the ones that could not be sold. A perpetual soup pot generates no recurring revenue. A fat crock replaces 12 grocery items with 1. A vinegar pie requires nothing the consumer does not already own. The industrial food system that emerged after the war needed Americans to buy, and to buy frequently. And the techniques that made families self-sufficient were obstacles to that purchase. The home economists who toured immigrant neighborhoods in the 1930s and 1940s were, whether they understood it or not, advanced scouts for an economy that needed those neighborhoods to forget what they knew. Food number 15, lard pie crust. A pie crust made with leaf lard, the soft, pure fat from around a pig's kidneys. Flakes in a way that no butter crust and certainly no shortening crust can match. The reason is structural. Lard's fat crystals are larger and more irregular, which creates discrete pockets of steam during baking and produces shatteringly crisp layers. A French pastry chef in 1933 would have killed for the lard. A Pennsylvania farm wife was using on a Tuesday afternoon to make a chicken pie. Crisco was introduced in 1911, but the marketing campaign that displaced lard did not hit its stride until the 1930s and 1940s, when Procter & Gamble's advertising budget reached saturation in women's magazines. The pitch was modernity. Lard was old-fashioned, smelly, suspect. Crisco was scientific, clean, white. The campaign worked. By 1955, lard was almost gone from American home kitchens. It is currently sold under the label Heritage Leaf Lard at specialty butchers for around $18 a pound. The pie crusts on the cover of food magazines are made with it, and the recipes are described as a return to forgotten technique. Food number 14, pickling in cracks and crocks. Number 14 was specifically targeted by New York City sanitarians in 1934. In the Lower East Side, on Hester Street and Orchard Street and the blocks between, Jewish and Italian and Polish housewives kept open earthenware crocks of half-sour pickles, sauerkraut, and giardiniera in their tenement kitchens. The crocks sat under cheesecloth, weighted with a clean stone, fermenting in the warm air of a coal stove for days or weeks. The Board of Health classified open fermentation as an unsanitary practice and issued thousands of citations during the decade. The actual science, that lacto-fermentation produces an acidic environment hostile to pathogens, and that traditional pickling is, if anything, safer than canning, was either unknown to inspectors or ignored. What the inspectors saw was foreign women doing foreign things in apartments they considered, on principle, suspect. The crocks went into closets. The vinegar pickle, shelf-stable and industrial, replaced the live ferment. 2 generations grew up thinking pickles came from a jar at the supermarket and tasted of nothing but acid. Lacto-fermented kosher dills are now sold at Whole Foods for $9 a jar, marketed for their probiotic content. The grandmothers were right. The Board of Health was wrong. Food number 13, bone broth as a beverage. Long before bone broth became a wellness product, it was a mid-morning snack. In coal towns across West Virginia and Kentucky in the 1930s, miners' wives ladled hot beef bone broth into mugs and sent it to school children in tin pails alongside a biscuit. The broth was free, made from bones the butcher gave away with a wave, and it carried more usable protein and minerals than the milk that would later replace it. The science was understood intuitively. Long-simmered bones release glycine, proline, and gelatin in proportions that support joint and gut tissue. Children who drank broth daily had stronger nails, fewer broken bones, and better recovery from winter illness. None of this was published. None of it had to be. It was simply observed across generations. Federal school lunch programs, which began consolidating in 1946 under the National School Lunch Act, standardized milk as the school beverage and quietly displaced regional traditions like broth. Within 20 years, the practice was gone. Bone broth in a cardboard carton at the grocery store now retails for $8 a quart and is described on the label as ancestral. Food number 12, whey bread. Wisconsin dairy farms in 1934 produced staggering quantities of whey, the watery byproduct of cheese making, pale green and slightly sweet, and most of it was poured into pig troughs or simply onto fields. But farm wives who knew waste when they saw it used whey as the liquid in their bread doughs. The result was a loaf that rose higher, kept longer, and tasted faintly of yogurt. Whey contains lactose, lactic acid, and a complete set of milk proteins. As a bread liquid, it feeds yeast more aggressively than water, tenderizes the crumb through acidification, and adds a depth that water alone cannot. A baker in 2026 would call this a poolish adjacent technique. A Wisconsin farm wife in 1934 called it bread. Industrial bread production, which scaled rapidly during and after the war, standardized water as the only cost-effective bread liquid. Whey was reclassified as a waste product, then later as a feed ingredient, then later still as a protein supplement for bodybuilders. The bread tradition died with the small dairy. Artisan bakeries are now reintroducing whey loaves at $6 a slice. Food number 11, salt box pork. In a tenant farmhouse in eastern Tennessee in 1936, a wooden salt box, a small hinged container nailed to a wall above the stove, held the family's preserved pork. Strips of belly and shoulder were buried in coarse salt for weeks, then hung to dry, then, when needed, shaved thin and cooked into beans, greens, or cornbread. The technique predated refrigeration by centuries and required nothing but salt, time, and patience. Properly salt-cured pork is shelf-stable for months. The salt draws moisture out of the meat to a level where bacterial growth cannot occur, and the slow drying concentrates flavor into something dense, savory, and almost cheesy. Modern charcuterie boards are built on the same principle. USDA inspections after 1939 made it increasingly difficult for small farms to sell home-cured pork commercially, and home curing for personal use, while not illegal, was discouraged in extension publications throughout the 1940s and 1950s. The recommended replacement was commercially produced bacon and processed lunch meat. By 1970, saltbox pork was a memory. Italian guanciale, which is the same product made by the same method, is sold at Italy for $46 a pound. Food number 10, acorn flour. In rural California in 1933, descendants of Pomo and Miwok families, pushed to the edges of the cash economy by the Depression, returned to a food their ancestors had eaten for thousands of years. White oak acorns were collected in fall, leached of tannins by repeated soaking in cold stream water, dried and ground into a fine cream-colored flour with a flavor between chestnut and almond. Acorn flour is dense in slow-burning carbohydrates, healthy fats, and minerals. The leaching process, when done correctly, removes the bitter tannins entirely while preserving the nutritional content. It was a complete starvation food, meaning in the original sense of the term, a food that prevented starvation, and it was used quietly by native and rural communities throughout the 1930s. Korean and Japanese acorn flours now sell on specialty grocery websites for $14 a pound. Indigenous-led food sovereignty programs in California are working to restore the practice in the communities that lost it. Food number 9. Coffee from what's left. Real coffee in 1933 cost about 30 cents a pound and was, for many families, a luxury ration by the spoonful. The substitutes were ingenious. Roasted barley, ground and brewed, produced a malty, smoky beverage that tasted plausibly of coffee. Roasted dandelion root dug from the yard in early summer made a darker, more bitter cup with measurable diuretic properties. Chicory, already a coffee extender in Louisiana for 100 years, spread north during the Depression and never left New Orleans. These substitutes were not pretending to be coffee. They were their own beverages with their own qualities. Roasted barley contains B vitamins. Dandelion root supports liver function. Chicory adds inulin, a prebiotic fiber that modern wellness writers describe as gut supportive. Notice how often the regulators' argument was modernity and how often the argument was wrong. The home economist with the clipboard, the federal inspector, the school lunch administrator, the food magazine editor, they were not, in their own minds, attacking poor women's cooking. They believed they were liberating those women from a past that science had outgrown. The science, as it turns out, had not outgrown anything. It had simply not yet caught up. Lactofermentation, bone broth, animal fat, fermented dairy, organ meat, slow stocks, every one of these has been revindicated by nutritional research published since 2000. The grandmothers were correct. Their accusers were operating on assumptions that would not survive a single peer-reviewed study. And in the gap between confident wrongness and quiet correctness, an entire food culture was destroyed. Food number 8. Mock apple pie. Mock apple pie, made with Ritz crackers, sugar, lemon juice, and cream of tartar, was originally a pioneer dish from the 1850s, when actual apples were unavailable on the western frontier. It returned with force during the Depression, when even families with apple trees often had to sell the fruit for cash and could not afford to bake their own. The crackers, soaked in a spiced sugar syrup, plumped up and developed a texture eerily similar to baked apple. Soft, slightly resistant, faintly tart. The trick is in the cream of tartar, which provides the malic acid bite that apples normally supply. The result is genuinely convincing. Blind taste tests in the 1930s and again in the 1990s consistently showed that most people could not identify it as fake. The recipe still circulates among older home cooks. It deserves better than embarrassment. Food number 7. Cornmeal mush, sliced and fried. Number 7 was banned in school cafeterias by 1939, replaced with something demonstrably worse. In Appalachia and across the rural South, a thick cornmeal porridge was cooked in a heavy pot, poured into a loaf pan, and chilled overnight. In the morning, it was sliced like bread, dredged in flour, and fried in bacon grease until the outside was golden and the inside still creamy. Served with sorghum syrup or molasses, it was a complete breakfast for under 3 cents per serving. Italian polenta, which is functionally identical, is now served at upscale brunch spots with a poached egg and a side of mushrooms for $19. Food number 6. The Sunday chicken that lasted a week. A whole chicken in 1934 cost about 35 cents and was, for most families, a Sunday-only event. The bird was roasted whole on Sunday, the breast and thighs eaten that day. Monday, the wings and back went into a chicken pot pie. Tuesday, the leftover meat was shredded into a salad with celery and homemade mayonnaise. Wednesday, the carcass went into a stock pot. Thursday, the stock became soup. Friday, the soup was thickened with rice and stretched. 6 meals from one chicken. Nothing was discarded except the gallbladder. A roast chicken at a restaurant on the Lower East Side now costs $42. It serves 2. Food number 5. The Hoover Stew Heritage. Named for the president whose policies were blamed for the misery, Hoover stew was the official meal of the Depression-era breadline. Hot dogs, macaroni, canned tomatoes, and whatever beans were available. It was made in cauldrons by Salvation Army volunteers, by labor unions, by soup kitchens, by churches, and in a million private kitchens where families had nothing else. Mid-century cookbooks omitted Hoover's stew entirely, and the post-war prosperity narrative actively buried Depression cooking as a category. The dish survived only in family memory and in the occasional church potluck. A version of it is now sold at a restaurant in Detroit as Depression stew with heritage hot dogs and heirloom beans for $18 a bowl. Food. Number 4. Lard-wrapped eggs. On a farm in eastern Iowa in 1932, a woman named Frida Hauptmann is sealing fresh eggs in lard. She rubs each egg gently with rendered pork fat, stacks them in a stoneware crock, and stores the crock in the cool corner of the cellar. The eggs will keep, edible and palatable, for up to 9 months. The technique works because eggshells are porous, and the lard creates an airtight barrier that prevents both moisture loss and bacterial intrusion. Other versions of the technique used water glass, a sodium silicate solution, to the same effect. Both methods preserved eggs through winters when hens stopped laying, eliminating the need for refrigeration entirely. The technique is now being revived by homesteaders and small farmers, taught through online courses that charge $80 for what Frida Hauptmann would have explained for free to anyone who knocked on her door. Food. Number 3. Wild greens from the lot. In a Detroit alley in 1933, a Polish woman bends to gather lamb's quarters, dandelion greens, purslane, and chickweed from the cracked margin of a vacant lot. By evening, those greens are stewed with onion, vinegar, and a strip of bacon. Per ounce, they contain more iron than spinach, more vitamin C than orange juice, and more omega-3 fatty acids than most cultivated vegetables. They cost, in cash, nothing. Foraging during the Depression was widespread, sophisticated, and deeply local. Italian families picked dandelion. Greek families picked horta. Black families across the South gathered poke salad, parsley, lamb's quarters, and creasy greens. The knowledge of which plants were edible, when and how to prepare them, was passed down by mothers and grandmothers and was, in many communities, the difference between adequate and inadequate nutrition. Food number 2. Sourdough from the air. Number 2 was so effective that the canned food industry, and to be fair, the commercial yeast industry as well, lobbied for years to convince housewives it was unsafe. A sourdough starter is, in mechanical terms, a small ecosystem of wild yeast and lactic acid bacteria captured from the ambient air of a kitchen and fed continuously with flour and water. Once established, a starter can live for decades, even centuries. Bakers in San Francisco are still using starters that cross the country with the 49ers. Sourdough fermentation does several things that commercial yeast cannot. It pre-digests gluten, making the bread tolerable to many people who otherwise cannot eat wheat. It produces an acidic environment that releases minerals from the grain. And it builds flavor across hours of slow rise. Flavor that no fast bread can match. What you cannot quite see in any single one of these entries, but what becomes unmistakable when you stack them together, is the scale of the transfer. Real, accumulated culinary knowledge, built over centuries, refined by hunger, validated by survival, was extracted from American kitchens within the span of 2 generations and replaced with branded products that performed worse and cost more. The women who lost this knowledge were not consulted. They were not warned. They were simply told by a series of authorities they had been trained to trust that what they knew was wrong. And when the same knowledge returned decades later on the menus of restaurants and the labels of premium grocery items, it returned without their names attached. The grandmother who taught Wisconsin to bake whey bread is not in any cookbook. The Slovak woman who kept her stockpot alive for 30 years has no plaque. The credit, when it comes back at all, goes to the chef who rediscovered food number one, the shared pot. Number one is not a dish. It is a practice, and it was the foundation of everything else. In a coal camp kitchen in West Virginia in 1933, in a tenement on Mulberry Street in Manhattan, on a sharecropper's porch in Mississippi, in a Polish neighborhood in Hamtramck and a Greek neighborhood in Astoria, when one family had food and another did not. The pot was shared. A wife who had bread sent half to a neighbor whose husband had been laid off. A woman whose chickens were laying delivered eggs to the family 3 doors down whose hens had stopped. A grandmother who had a Sunday roast made a stew on Monday large enough that the family upstairs could eat from it too. There was no welfare program. There was no food stamp. There was the unwritten and entirely binding obligation that hungry neighbors did not stay hungry while you had a stove. The Depression survived on this. It is not a sentimental claim. It is, if you read the oral histories, the operative truth of how millions of people didn't starve. This is what the regulators could not regulate, what the home economists could not standardize, what the food companies could not sell. It was the technique behind every other technique on this list, because none of those tricks worked alone. The fat crock fed the neighbor. The perpetual soup pot fed the visitor. The bread, the broth, the foraged greens, the salted pork, they moved between kitchens because that is what kitchens were for. Post-war suburbanization broke this. The single-family home with the closed door and the 2-car garage was specifically engineered by federal housing policy and by mass market advertising to make the shared pot obsolete. Privacy replaced proximity. Convenience replaced reciprocity. The neighborhoods that had carried each other through the worst decade in American economic history were dissolved into subdivisions where nobody knew anybody well enough to send a stew. This is the thing that was actually banned, not the food. The food can come back, and parts of it have. But the social fabric that gave the food meaning, the assumption that your kitchen was in some real sense also your neighbor's, that has been gone for 60 years, and no restaurant menu can put it back. If you have a grandmother still living, call her. Today, if you can. Ask her how her mother stretched a chicken across a week. Ask her what her family did with the bones, with the fat, with the greens that grew in the lot behind the building. Write down what she tells you. Write the names of the people who taught her. Most of these techniques survive now only because someone, and in some kitchen on some afternoon, sat down with a notebook before it was too late. And if she is gone, if that voice is already lost, find a neighbor who remembers. Find an aunt. Find the 80-year-old at your church who has never been asked. Somebody in your community is the last living archive of a technique that took 200 years to develop, and that archive walks with a cane. Tell me in the comments, which of these 20 would you actually try? And does your family still cook any of them? I read every comment, and the recipes that show up there are how this knowledge stays alive. The pot is still on the stove. Somebody just has to remember to share it.